Hi, my name is Nikos, and happy Spooktober. This last summer I played all the way through Half-Life 2 for the first time. Right, took me long enough. And during the game's runtime, grotesque monsters and body horror amalgamations attack the player. Despite the abundance of alien monsters in Half-Life, the setting itself is what I remember most from the game. The tone of the game is absolutely dismal. An overwhelming alien empire has conquered a wrecked and ruined Earth. Beset by alien wildlife and parasites forced onto our planet from across the universe, civilization, and even the atmosphere itself has been completely shaped by the Combine's will. With the entire sea level being dropped several feet, along with human populations being forced into impoverished cities that go by numbers rather than names. These cold, desolate environments of Half-Life 2 dug up a nostalgic feeling within me. I was suddenly reminded of when I played Halo Combat Evolved as a wee lad. It then reminded me of how much I appreciated the first Halo game, and how it feels and holds a tone very different from the other games in the Halo series that is difficult to explain. While Halo 2 onwards have more upbeat, action-packed tones, the first Halo is ominous, mysterious, and sometimes downright terrifying. It's also the bloodiest of the Halo games. Bullet wounds and melee attacks cause a lot of blood spray in the game. I mean, dude, look how much I messed up this Elite. Combat Evolved sits among the peak of eerie video games from before 2005. And it's honestly kind of hard to describe why this game is so eerie and quite unnerving at times. So, what is it that makes Halo Combat Evolved so terrifying? Activate your rifle's flashlight. We're going in, Marines. Halo Combat Evolved opens with a war for a lost cause. Humanity is decidedly on the back foot as the overzealous Covenant alien races melt human planets into carbon and smash their military with superior technology and numbers. A seemingly blind jump in desperation leads the UNSC ship, known as the Pillar of Autumn, to a mysterious ring-shaped planet, one of which had never been seen before. The human crew aboard the Autumn has but one advantage over the Covenant, the biomechanically engineered super soldier known as the Master Chief, our player character. The Covenant catch up to the Autumn in space, and after a short naval scuffle, Covenant infantry begins boarding the human vessel. Gameplay-wise, the Pillar of Autumn serves as an excellent tutorial for the player. It throws only two basic forms of enemy at the player, the shielded, skillful elites, as well as the cowardly, weak grunts, and very few weapon options are given to the player. Here you learn about grenades, melee, crouching, and more. So far, this is a classic setup for a sci-fi universe and for a first-person shooter story mode. And it's rather run-of-the-mill right now. Upon evacuating the Autumn, the Master Chief, as well as the Pillar of Autumn's captain, and all surviving human crews are left no choice but to plunge to the surface of this mysterious ring-shaped world.
Alert! Covenant dropship inbound. They must be looking for survivors. I recommend immediate evasion.
Stepping foot onto the ring for the first time was an iconic moment for players. Gazing up into the skybox to see the planet you are currently standing on wrapping up and around your head was a mesmerizing visual that can be best described as psychedelic, alien, or even sublime. The ring itself is all-encompassing, and the player will always be reminded of it just by looking to the skybox. The player has only mere moments to take in their new setting as almost immediately, Covenant search parties descend from space to hunt down the surviving shipwrecked human forces. In this mission, titled Halo, the player regroups with survivors and wards off the Covenant in decidedly alien architecture. Definitely not Covenant architecture because it's not purple enough, and also definitely not a natural formation thanks to Cortana's helpful and informative hint.
This cave is not a natural formation. Someone built it, so it must lead somewhere.
The Halo Ring is an artificial world, full of alien structures and facilities. These facilities appear dormant, but the player will quickly discover that many of these structures are very much awake and currently operating. As for the ring's surface, it's full of plants, trees, and geological formations such as rocks and mountains. But these environments feel off, out of place even. They're far too sterile and clean to be natural. There isn't a single living animal or creature native to the ring of note. When Bungie designed the game, the vacant atmosphere of Halo was only partially intentional. It has long been known that Halo Combat Evolved was originally planned to showcase dinosaurs and other alien beasts that would have populated the ring. In the final release, ambient wildlife was cut, well, aside from sea worms and moths, leaving us with a rather lifeless ring. As the Master Chief leads Marines across Halo to battle the Covenant in desperate guerrilla strikes, several mysteries remain unanswered to the player, driven in part due to how our minds are completely perplexed by the strange world around us. At the forefront of these questions are these two. Since the Covenant didn't build Halo, who did? And further, to what purpose is there creating a ring-shaped planet full of active, alien facilities that seem to have no point or purpose? This leads me into perhaps my favorite part about Halo Combat Evolved's level design. Liminal spaces are the subject of an internet aesthetic portraying empty or abandoned places that appear eerie, forlorn, and often surreal. Liminal itself is a term that describes something that is intermediate between two states, transitional or indeterminate. It's a rather abstract term, and liminal spaces themselves are really huge on the internet nowadays, in part due to the unnerving and scary images of the backrooms. These liminal spaces really do attract a cult following because they elicit a very odd feeling in people who view them. It's a sort of nostalgic dread, as I like to explain it, and when I first encountered liminal spaces, I fell in love with the whole art style. It's really odd to me. I just love the idea of just how empty these are and how eerie they are. When I was a kid, in high-rise buildings, I used to go down to the basement floors and just chill down there with nobody down there. Just vacant, dimly lit halls. And all I could hear were the ceiling lights above me and the occasional groans from the elevator. While most modern video games push graphics budgets by oversaturating their level scenes with objects, rocks, foliage, and other assets, Halo Combat Evolved's environments are rather barren due to the limited hardware in the original Xbox. This lack of detail is complemented by the dull and colder color hues chosen for much of the game. The cold, flavorless Forerunner hallways, elevator shafts, and copy-pasted endless mazes somewhat mirror the empty exterior portions of the ring. The muted blues and grays of these halls leave the player out of their element, a far cry to the bright and warm human architecture aboard the Autumn. Sometimes, wandering in these spaces as a kid made me feel slightly unnerved, as if something was around the corner or lurking in the shadows, similar to when I explored those underground basements that were completely vacant. And it always kept me curious as to what these completely vacant, bland Forerunner structures were meant to be. In Combat Evolved, these Forerunner spaces are rudimentary, rough, and angular. Through this design, they show their age and appear to be as ancient as the rocks around them. Complementing this factor is how stark and bleak these environments are, with dim to no lighting at all. Upon going topside from the Forerunner structures, as I mentioned earlier, the surface mirrors these facilities, almost equally as lifeless. Dull color palettes, blue-gray stones, and dark, lush emerald greens. The color choices of the top side of the ring make for a rather depressing environment, almost as if the art design team wanted you to feel like you were on an uncanny world that was created and poorly disguised as a living ecosystem. In a way, cutting the wildlife from Halo ended up complementing the setting of Halo brilliantly. The whole ring has the player asking, why? Coupling with Halo's art design, the sound design in Halo ties it all together. The sublime, vast canyons that dwarf the player are beset by the howls of hostile winds. Snowfall, rain, and ambient bugs can be heard chirping across the ring, making the ring feel even more significant and vast. The canyon walls themselves echo sounds the player makes in a quiet landscape to make the player feel even smaller and the ring feel even more significant and sublime. This effect is amplified in sections absent of music, enemies, and friendlies. Totally vacant. The main characters of the game don't speak very often, reserving it to further draw the player's focus into the world itself. Atmospheric noises can also be heard throughout these solemn halls too. They yawn and breathe, almost as if they serve as the circulatory system of the ring, as if they're even alive. Halo, as all great game narratives do, sucks the player into its world. The art design, narrative, sound design, and game mechanics mold together to effectively put the player on the Halo ring alongside the Chief. Because of this, standing in a random corner of one of these empty rooms will induce feelings of liminality for some. This helps build a compelling and ominous narrative. As the player continues their guerrilla war against the Covenant, the mystery of Halo lingers in the back of their mind, driving them forward to uncover the secrets to this ring-shaped planet. The Master Chief arrives at the control room after slaughtering
any inhuman son of a bitch
that stood in his way. The Chief plugs Cortana, his AI, into the main terminal, fully accepting a much-needed victory against the Covenant. Cortana has access to all of the ring's data stores and can finally piece together the purpose of Halo. Despite this recent victory, Cortana tells Chief some very unsettling news. She mentions that there's no time to explain and urges the Chief to leave the control room and head for the swamps without her. As the Mission 343 Guilty Spark opens, we witness fleeing ranks of Covenant soldiers. The eerie bog is beset by a thick, black fog, and after being dropped into the swamp, we slowly begin to unravel the disaster that unfolded here.
Dropship Victor 9, Killer of Autumn. Assistance. We are under attack by some new kind of hostile citizen Covenant. Captain Keys has been captured by hostiles. Dug in at a large structure.
Down to dropships, not a sign of human life anywhere. Gunshots coming from rooms that appear empty when we approach them. All the while, this eerie environment has the player checking the tree line to see if anyone's watching them from the thick fog. After descending into the structure in the depths of the swamp, the player encounters the same liminal spaces as before. This time, something is very off. The minimal Covenant presence is feeble, lacking their elite squad leaders, and gruesome massacres litter some of the halls. Lights flicker, unknown goo drips from the ceilings in isolated locations. Many doors and Forerunner facilities and structures down here are damaged or completely destroyed, which is definitely not from the Covenant, as they worship these structures, believing them to be made by their gods. Something else entirely, with no concern for architectural integrity, is down here with the player. The first sign of friendly human life appears to be driven mad.
Stay back! Stay back! You're not turning me into one of those things! I'll blow your brains out! Get away from me! Sarge, Mendoza, Vicente. Oh God, the things took them away. They're gone!
This setup is brilliant. It subverts the player's expectations and brings them out of their comfort zone. They were perfectly content with mowing down Covenant waves one by one and were steadily being put on edge now, bracing for something to completely upset everything they've become used to in Halo.
Why do we always have to listen to this old stuff, Sarge?
Watch your mouth, son. This stuff is your history. It should remind you grunts what we're fighting to protect.
Hey, if the Covenant want to wipe out this particular part of my history, that's fine by me.
Where's that coming from,
Everywhere.
Mendoza?
I don't... There! Mira!
After watching a live leak video, the player is introduced to the Flood. Alien parasites that absorb living creatures into a hive mind of shared memories that lash out against the living in an endless mission to consume all. A parasite so devastating that entire ecosystems and planet atmospheres are reshaped at their will if they manage to gain enough power. These creepy parasites mutate anything they can get their feelers onto into grotesque, tortured monsters, and were responsible for the destruction of the original creators of the Halo ring over 100,000 years ago. The player now roams the halls created by this fallen alien empire, the race that fell to the insatiable parasites that now lurk the containment facility that was meant to lock them in stasis for eternity. It's as if these two titans, the Forerunners and the Flood, are clashing once more, 100,000 years later. Flood-possessed humans and elites begin to rush the player across the damaged facility. With the introduction of this new and pretty terrifying threat, the player finally gets a reprieve. Finally, an elevator out of this hellhole. Let's ascend to the swamp again and get out of here. Now the Flood use guns as well. Flood beings retain their former lives' memories enough to chaotically fire whatever weapons they can get their hands on. And let's go back to the bloodiness of this game. The Flood is gory. Unloading rounds into Flood combat forms will delimb them and send chunks of their organs and body parts all across the room. This also ties into gameplay mechanics, where you can target the limbs of a Flood form to remove their weapon, or even chop off the claw they use to melee you with. Environmental storytelling knocks it out of the park in this level as well. You could see the effort put in by the Covenant to block themselves in to keep the infection out with these piles of purple crates. Marine bodies can be found huddled alongside Covenant ones. They became so desperate that they set aside their differences and fought to the last man. The Flood reveal was a classic horror setup, complete with a found footage video, and now each subsequent level becomes much darker and far more intense as the stakes are raised. Chaos has now erupted across the ring, and from here on out in the game, isolation really begins to set in. Many sections of the campaign throughout Halo have the Chief fighting completely alone. Marines only periodically join the Master Chief in his fight against the Covenant. After the Master Chief departs the swamps, from this point forward, no more Marines join the Master Chief in his fight, as there are very few remaining on the ring after the Flood have become virulent. And after leaving Cortana behind in the control room, no one familiar would be keeping the player company. This nails home a feeling of intense isolation in these already eerie spaces, and often it is up to the Chief and Cortana alone to continue humanity's fight. The first sign of life from the creators of the installation then appears to the player, as they are teleported to what is perhaps the most notable facility on Halo, and also the most infamously hated mission in the game. Okay, I'll admit, this level is really bad. It's insanely repetitive, dull, tense, difficult, and quite infuriating. But you cannot deny that this level is freaky. Some of the darkest and emptiest areas can be found in the liminal space labyrinth of Installation 04. The library, a structure with no access to the above ground, and that is now infested with the Walking Dead, is without a doubt drab and boring. This mission is a drag in a dark, monotonous, nearly featureless and confusing facility. The player spends the entire slog pushing through horde after horde of Flood creatures. With nothing interesting in sight and an absolute labyrinth to fight through, this mission is kind of like Halo's backrooms. Despite the presence of Flood jump scares and very dimly lit scary areas in this mission, the most terrifying part of the library is the introduction of the Rocket Flood. After claiming the activation index for Halo and finally beating this nightmare of a mission, the Master Chief is teleported back to Cortana in the control room, where he finally learns the complete truth of Halo's purpose. Halo is effectively a giant stalemate button that wipes out all life in the galaxy. The ultra-powerful Forerunners were so out of options that they opted to sacrifice themselves to stop the Flood from winning. The fact that an empire as powerful as the Forerunners were so unable to defeat the Flood that they needed to make a weapon that eradicates all sentient life just to prevent the Flood from continuing to spread is very disheartening. A terrifying prospect, which only further displays how overwhelmingly dangerous and all-powerful the Flood is without telling the player. This was even more worrisome, especially because minute by minute, the Flood was growing in strength exponentially as they spread across the ring that was built to destroy them. The clock was ticking, and one man alone had a chance at stopping them. Cortana and the Chief damage the ring's systems along the way to prevent it from firing, and then they find Captain Keyes, who was infected by the Flood in the initial outbreak and brought aboard the Truth and Reconciliation against his will. The Flood were attempting to organize what was left of the Captain into a fleshy supercomputer known as a Gravemind, in order to effectively coordinate their hive mind with proper strategy. A grotesque detail most miss is if you look at the massive Flood in front of you, the limbs and pieces of numerous lost human souls can be seen conglomerated alongside Captain Keyes. And this is more apparent if you turn on the anniversary graphics. Covenant bodies are piled up all over the ship for Flood feeding grounds, and At this point, the Truth and Reconciliation has almost completely fallen to the flood. The Covenant have very little control over it. After Chief punches through the brain of Captain Keyes to get his neural implants, which are necessary for detonating the Pillar of Autumn, for Halo's finale, the Maw, an absolute brawl is fought out in the bleak halls of the crashed Pillar of Autumn. To me, it's kind of perfect that, although there was all this backtracking in the campaign, where the player revisits previous missions, I think it's pretty perfect that the player enters the Autumn through one of the escape pod hatches, mirroring the first level's escape pod sequence, and making the narrative poetically come full circle. Towards the end of the mission, there's a really eerie detail that I don't see enough people talking about online. Right before engineering, the player can stock up on rockets and ammo in the armory, but in the dark corners of the room, the only use of active camo flood elites can be found. These invisible elites hang out in silence, waiting to jump the player while they're distracted gathering rockets and ammo. It's genuinely eerie. And then an absolute horde comes at you as soon as you kill the first invisible elite. So, there's no rest in this game with the flood. With that, the Master Chief destabilizes the reactor, and one show-stopping Warthog race against the clock later, the ring is destroyed, and the game closes with everything from the start of the story being destroyed aside from the Chief and Cortana. Well, aside from the Marines and Covenant who made it out in the books. That and Mr. Dust and Echoes.
Did anyone else make it?
Just Dust and Echoes.
Dust and Echoes. We'll go back for them.
We're all that's left.
I think Dust and Echoes was the guy that opened that door in the library.
That's true.
An entire Covenant
You know,
armada
I always did
murdering
want
in the flood.
Sergeant Johnson to come out of some little cubby hole here.
Well, we had a bunch of legendary ending jokes where Sergeant Johnson came out brushing his teeth, and he came out doing a bunch of funny things, which we couldn't do. Now, the funniest thing about that was, I remember when fans finally were able to go in Halo PC, I think probably, and sort of detach the camera and see what was going on and try to see what was under the Chief's helmet. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the Chief takes off his helmet. He's wearing another helmet.
A beautifully dark and sinister story. One that started as a solid sci-fi shooter and ended as a survival horror FPS. The halfway point twist in Halo is awesome, and the whole campaign has a stellar narrative that is carried generously by the art direction and sound design of the game. But that's just the single player mode. I've seen people share online before that wandering around empty multiplayer maps from pre-2010s games alone creeps them out. Half-Life's multiplayer maps, running in Valve's own Source engine, are infamous examples of unintentionally eerie scenes in gaming. Many other games that use the same engine harbor the same effect. Gary's mod, Counter-Strike, all of these scenes feel sterile and pretty desolate. Although not constructed in the same engine, Halo Combat Evolved is no exception to this rule. Often after I played through the campaign, I decided to just wander around the multiplayer maps on my own. After visiting all of them, some of these maps are pretty bizarre. Let's rapid fire some of them. Sidewinder, Wizard, Prisoner, Rat's Race. Hang 'em High is canonically who knows where, honestly. It's seemingly lost somewhere, secluded on Installation 04. Hang 'em High is a very large, vast open space, complete with a view of the sky, but not the ground, removing any indication as to where we are at on the map. Derelict lives up to its name, a space station stuck in a vacuum. The crown of the liminal space multiplayer maps goes to Chiron TL34, the teleporter maze on Mars with no conceivable exit. All the while, the hums and howls of the ambience make all these maps feel barely alive. While I wandered these as a kid, with way too much spare time, I always wondered if I'd run into some sort of player or entity. Even alone, I felt like I was being watched by someone. It's no surprise that, with the early advent of the internet and lack of fact-checking sources, many began believing and sharing gaming urban legends about ghosts haunting these old games. Halo 2 also has a bit of a liminal quality to it, especially its multiplayer maps that creeped me out as a kid when I walked on them alone. And speaking of gaming urban legends and Halo 2, a hoax was born, the Ghost of Lockout, which took the internet by storm. A glitched entity with no name tag that slid around maps without animation that was consecrated on one of the most desolate, cold maps in Halo 2. While these ghost sightings were likely just glitches, or in the case of online matches, networking errors, there was no legitimate proof to debunk these hoaxes and legends back in the day. Therefore, the Ghost of Lockout and other gaming campfire stories that accompanied these classically liminal games spread like wildfire. This resulted in the scaring of numerous kids across the world, and also resulted in many deciding to go ghost hunting across many Halo maps to see if they could witness these mysterious anomalies for themselves. It wouldn't be a Halo Combat Evolved retrospective without mentioning the modded maps. Halo Custom Edition launched as a PC port for Halo complete with mod tools. This allowed anyone to dive in and build maps and experiences for everyone to enjoy. In the process of using the same engine, these maps often carry over that same feeling of isolation and liminality that the Bungie levels do. They also make use of the same textures and ambient sounds as well, making these expanses appear stark and ancient. In some cases, these maps come off as more eerie due to how large and unpolished many of these levels can be. And I'm not even talking about the Halo horror maps. These horror maps are peak in the unnerving old PC game factor, draping near darkness over already ominous and liminal spaces. Many, including myself, recall experiences on some of these landmark modded maps. And today, wandering these abandoned arenas alone is a surreal experience. Halo Combat Evolved was a monumentally definitive piece of entertainment from the early 2000s, but many look past how this game handles its tone. I personally love this tone. It reminds me of old PC games from the 1990s. It always felt like a walk through the woods at night. It's what Halo doesn't show or tell you that speaks volumes. One doesn't need to see the Forerunners, or their battle with the Flood, or the Human Covenant War to understand how drastic and important these events are. Instead, they are left in ambient wonder, surrounded by a mystery so significant to the galaxy, the player only needs to gaze to the horizon to be reminded of its significance. Across the first Halo ring, we find spaces from our youth that we remember fondly, and in some cases, not so fondly. These memories left a permanent mark on Halo fans everywhere. When we view these spaces now, a flood of memories return of mixed, highly charged emotions, but this time, we receive a new feeling, a feeling of transition, the passage of time, liminality. These same hallways and canyons are now over 20 years old. Once brand new and full of wonder and friends, now we tread them alone, in a new light. I cannot deny that playing through the old Halo games is eerie, not just because of the hordes of Flood, or dark, featureless quiet corridors, or the dead surface formations of the ring, but now because I fully understand the weight of how fast time has disappeared, and further, how powerless I am to stop it.